I wanted to just ask you about, you're from Colombo, so you obviously have some sort of spent your youth, part of your youth at least, in the city. And you also traveled when you were very young to East Africa with your family and you studied there. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like? You mentioned Somalia as well. So could you just give us a brief on what it was like adjusting as a Sri Lankan, Asian, South Asian in that part of the world?
Well, I'm in Africa, Somalia then. This is in the 1960s. Big country. You can see as far as the horizon. That's the first thing I realized. In Sri Lanka, you can never see the horizon because we're built up, we're hilly terrain, there are houses, there's this. Somalia, there's nothing. It's bush. It's semi-desert as far as the eye can see. And the people there are extraordinarily beautiful. So as a child, you see this very extraterrestrial landscape, some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And these strange people who are long and lean, very tall. So as a child, you just absorb this. You don't think of it as being different. All you know is you are in outer space, pretty much.
How is that informed? I mean, as growing up, it's a formative experience for you in Africa, but has that informed any of your writing? Do you see that coming out in your writing at all?
Yes, in some stories. I would love to set a novel in Somalia. Sadly, I can't because I would have to go back, and I'm being told time and time again by Somalis, don't go back. It's not worth it.
What would you say to someone that's a young Sri Lankan, or even a 42-year-old Sri Lankan who's trying to get into writing? I read the author Christopher Hitchens say that writing is not something he does, it's something he is, that he is a writer, that he has to write, that he can't not write. Is that how you feel, or is it something now that you've sort of, it's become part of yourself, or is it something you do? And how would you advise someone to go about it?
I think that guy was right. It's something physiological. You have to vomit it out when it's there. There are two types of writers. There is that type, like me, the lazy bugger, who vomits it out when the time comes. And there are very disciplined writers like Shyam Salvatore. If he finishes a book today, he will start the new one the next day. That's also compulsion, but it's also discipline. In my case, the compulsion occurs not on a regular basis. Right. I just have to wait for it to come to me, and then it comes out very quickly.
Getting back to the Ceylon Literary Festival, I have always wondered this about the word Ceylon. On one side, Sri Lanka, where we want to be proud Sri Lankans and all of that, and there's a bit of a colonial hangover that exists in certain parts of society. The word Ceylon has all these various connotations related to colonialism and that sort of thing as well. But at the same time, it's also a brand, especially in certain parts of the world, Ceylon tea, and where the former colonial countries, they have some idea of what Ceylon is. Is there some sort of friction or contradiction between festivals or events or anyone using the word Ceylon versus Sri Lanka? How do you, I just want to know what you think about this. Because there are some political things as well.
No, that's a very good question. First of all, I would like to say that we own that name. It's not a colonial name. If you think about it, the colonials, the people who came here before, called us Serendib, they called us Taprobane, they called us lots and lots of different things. Ceylon being one of those names.
Right.
So it's like the architecture. You see an old Sri Lankan Balaua, and you can look at that architecture and say, oh, this is colonial architecture. Those pillars are Doric or Ionic. Well, they could be Doric or Ionic, but they're also Sri Lankan. So the name is the same thing. I don't think colonials, and they're dead and gone anyway, they can't own anything. So why are we giving them the ownership to that name? I chose it because, to me, and I'm so much older than you, it takes me back to the golden age of Sri Lankan arts. And I'm not talking about colonialism, but I'm just thinking of those times, the 43 group, or the Sri Lankan writers of the 60s and 70s, and then also 80s, 90s, Carl Muller, Yasmin Gunaratna. There are so many superb writers from those days who will die virtually unsung because we have decided to bury them and go on with the new. But they were there, and they were people I read when I was young. And I still think that was a golden age of literature.
So Ashok, you've got such a fascinating background with so varied around the world, right? I'd like to understand at what age did you come back to Sri Lanka? Or what
I
period? Was it
came
the
back
80s?
at the
Was it?
age of 30 in 1988,
And I
just
just
before my 31st birthday.
and you obviously someone you always had some interest in the arts, I assume, even when you were studying
No,
film. Not at all.
no.
What was the vibe like in Colombo at that time? What was it quite a with all the insurrections and the
Well,
ethnic strife? But what was the vibe in our
it was actually
society?
very vibrant.
Right.
Underneath, you had the arts club, you had this, you had that, you had good writers, you had Nidra Vittachi, you had, I mean, lots of people, Indu Dharma Sena, they were all active then. But what was nice then was it was a kind of a free-for-all. There was no stratification, and there was something slightly, faintly subversive about the arts then. It was not considered decent and proper. And it's like that phrase, don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington,
Right.
There was something slightly louche and a little bit under the
Yeah,
table
that's
about
a good
it.
point, because I always find that art is almost more powerful when it's a little bit subversive, isn't
Absolutely.
it?
You said it. You said it.
So, how have you seen the trajectory? How do you feel about the trajectory from that period to now? And I know, as I mentioned, there's been very talented Sri Lankans who've done very well. But how do
Yeah.
you feel about the whole scene? How has it evolved? Has it been to your satisfaction? Do you think it could have been different, better?
Yeah, it's there again a very tricky question, because on the one hand there are many more writers today and it is more democratic, but there's also a lot of rubbish written today, which there wasn't then. Um, at the same time, you have really sort of world-class hitters like Shahan Karunatilaka, who through there rises through and forges a path for the rest of us. So it's a good example that you can't keep a good Sri Lankan down. But quite often, for him to be a good Sri Lankan, you have to put him on a plane.
Right.
That is
So that
that is
then
the real
we look
trouble.
at him as something, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Whereas if he's here, we will do our best to destroy him, push him down. But if he goes abroad, he will flourish.